What if staying home was actually the most dangerous choice a Viking could make? For centuries, we've imagined Vikings as fearless raiders driven by bloodlust and conquest. But history tells a darker, more uncomfortable truth. The greatest threat to Viking survival wasn't foreign armies. It wasn't Christianity. It wasn't even the sea. It was home. To understand why Vikings abandoned Scandinavia, crossed oceans, and reshaped Europe, we must strip away the myths and look at the pressures that made leaving not just tempting, but necessary. And once you see those pressures, you may realize something unsettling. The Viking story isn't ancient history. It's a warning. Scandinavia was stunning and merciless. A land carved by jagged fjords, wrapped in endless forests, and surrounded by iron-cold seas that never truly rested. From a distance, it looked like paradise. Up close, it was a place that demanded constant negotiation with nature, and often, payment in blood. Beneath the beauty lay a fragile ecosystem, balanced on the edge of survival. The growing season was brutally short. One late frost, one summer of endless rain, and an entire year of planning could collapse overnight. Archaeological pollen records tell a silent story of repeated crop failures between the 6th and 9th centuries. Fields once green suddenly empty, soil exhausted, hope buried with the harvest. Zoo archaeology adds another layer to that story. Bones of cattle, sheep, and horses show signs of mass die-offs during prolonged winters. When fodder ran out, livestock fell first. And when the animals died, families followed. Winter didn't just bring cold. It brought isolation. Snow buried roads until villages vanished from one another. Rivers froze solid, cutting off trade and movement. Communities became islands of wood and turf, trapped for months at a time. If food ran out, help wasn't coming. There were no relief caravans, no safety net. Only hunger. Waiting patiently. This wasn't a temporary crisis. It wasn't a single bad decade. It was a recurring pattern, repeated generation after generation. Slowly, relentlessly, Scandinavia became a pressure cooker. A land of breathtaking beauty where survival was never guaranteed. And staying alive required far more than strength. Land meant survival. And in the Viking world, land was never enough. Unlike later feudal societies, Viking inheritance rarely protected the future. Land was divided among sons, generation after generation, until farms became smaller, weaker, and incapable of sustaining a family through winter. What began as inheritance slowly turned into erosion. A young man could reach adulthood, owning land in name only. A narrow strip of soil, barely enough to grow grain, not enough to raise livestock, certainly not enough to support a wife, children, or aging parents. And without land, a future collapsed before it began. While ordinary families struggled, powerful chieftains played a different game. Through strategic marriages, shifting alliances, and open force, they consolidated the best land, the richest soil, the safest valleys, the farms that could actually survive bad years. Power gathered. Opportunity vanished. This created a brutal social equation that every Viking understood. No land meant no marriage. No marriage meant no descendants. No descendants meant no name, no memory, no honor. Archaeology reflects this pressure clearly. Weapon burials increased sharply during periods of land stress. Not because Vikings were expanding, but because they were turning on one another. Conflict at home became constant. Feuds replaced stability. Violence filled the gaps where opportunity once existed. And when survival required fighting your own neighbors, leaving began to look less like abandonment, and more like the only rational choice left. Hunger explains survival, but it doesn't explain ambition. The Viking world was built on reputation. A man's worth wasn't measured by comfort, but by how his name would be spoken after he was gone. Honor wasn't inherited like land or livestock. It had to be earned, witnessed, remembered, repeated in stories. In crowded villages, those chances were disappearing. Too many men. Too little land. Too few paths to distinction. Archaeology can show us tools and graves. But the sagas reveal something deeper. They tell us that young men didn't dream of merely surviving winter. They dreamed of becoming someone, of carving a name large enough to outlive their bones. Across the sea, rumors traveled faster than ships. Stories of silver flowing through distant trade routes, of fertile land untouched by rigid inheritance laws, of power that could be seized through courage and skill not requested through birth. These weren't fantasies. They were possibilities. Restlessness spread through the Viking world, not as rebellion, but as pressure. A generation raised with strength and skill, trapped in a landscape with no room left to prove it. Staying meant waiting quietly for a life already decided. Leaving meant risk, but also recognition. And when the world at home could no longer contain ambition, the horizon began to look like an invitation. Vikings didn't stumble into exploration. They engineered it. Their longships were not accidents of history. They were deliberate solutions to a brutal problem. How to move faster than danger, farther than rivals, and beyond the limits of land. Every part of the ship served a purpose. Flexible hulls bent with waves instead of breaking under them, absorbing the violence of open water. Shallow drafts allowed ships to slip into rivers, beaches, and tidal flats where no deep-hulled vessel could follow. Lightweight construction made speed possible, and when necessary, allowed entire crews to lift their ships and carry them across land. This wasn't technology built only for raiding. It was technology built for movement. The longship erased boundaries. It connected fjords to rivers, coasts to inland settlements, and isolated worlds to one another. What land restricted, ships unlocked. Mobility became power. Once Viking ships could outrun storms, escape enemies, and vanish into shallow waters, the sea changed meaning. It was no longer a wall at the edge of the world. It became a corridor, a highway of opportunity, trade, intelligence, and expansion. And highways always lead somewhere, to new lands, new identities, and futures that could never be built by staying still. Leaving Scandinavia wasn't reckless. It was calculated. Vikings didn't sail blindly into the unknown. They observed first. They measured risk before accepting it. They studied wind patterns, learning when the sea would carry them and when it would destroy them. They read currents like maps, understanding how invisible forces could shorten or doom a journey. They watched birds, knowing that flight paths often pointed toward land long before coastlines appeared. They planned by seasons, choosing windows of time when survival was possible. Many early voyages were not invasions at all. They were scouting missions. Small crews tested coastlines, harbors, river mouths, and local responses. They gathered information, memorized landmarks, and returned with knowledge more valuable than silver. Some left with every intention of coming home richer, stronger, elevated in status. Others sailed knowing they might never see Scandinavia again. Both choices were deliberate. This wasn't escape driven by panic. It was strategic risk management practiced on a human scale. They weighed danger against reward. They accepted loss where gain outweighed certainty. And more often than history admits, the calculations worked. Here's the contradiction most people miss. The same communities that quietly pushed people out welcomed them back as heroes. When resources were scarce and land was tight, leaving looked like failure. An admission that you couldn't compete, that you didn't belong. But everything changed if you returned with proof. Silver bought respect. Foreign goods commanded attention. Stories of distant shores elevated status in ways land never could. Success rewrote memory. Suddenly, the man who had left wasn't desperate. He was bold. He wasn't reckless. He was visionary. Exile transformed into heroism. This contradiction created a powerful feedback loop. Every successful return made the next departure more acceptable. More ships were built. More young men volunteered. Ambition spread faster than caution. Leaving was no longer an exception. It became normalized. Almost expected. In time, staying behind began to look like the greater risk. Not because the sea was safe, but because opportunity had moved elsewhere. And once a culture starts rewarding those who leave, departure becomes tradition. Across the sea waited something Scandinavia could never offer. Possibility. Beyond the horizon lay fertile river valleys where soil was deep and forgiving, waterways that connected villages to markets, and markets to empires. Trade hubs where silver, silk, spices, and ideas flowed in every direction. This was a different kind of power, not inherited, not confined by rigid hierarchies, but earned through movement, negotiation, and adaptability. Vikings weren't just raiders sweeping in from the dark. They were merchants weighing profit, settlers breaking new ground, diplomats forging alliances, mercenaries selling skill where strength mattered more than lineage. They learned new languages to survive and to trade. They married locals to secure peace and legitimacy. They adapted customs, laws, and beliefs without losing their identity. What followed wasn't destruction alone. It was transformation. New towns emerged along rivers and coasts. Old borders blurred. Cultures mixed. And every successful settlement sent a quiet message back to Scandinavia. A message carried by returning ships, foreign goods, and changed men. There is another way to live, and it exists beyond the horizon. History often asks a simple question. Why did Vikings leave? The real answer is far more complex. They weren't driven by a single cause. They were pushed and pulled at the same time, caught between pressures at home and possibilities beyond the horizon. They were pushed by scarcity, land stretched too thin, food supplies balanced on the edge of failure. They were pushed by conflict feuds, rival clans, and violence that made stability impossible. They were pushed by inheritance pressure, a system that left many young men with no place to stand and no future to claim. At the same time, they were pulled forward. Pulled by opportunity, new lands where effort mattered more than birth. Pulled by wealth, silver, trade, and access to networks that connected distant worlds. Pulled by freedom, the chance to escape rigid hierarchies and build something of their own. Staying meant stagnation. A life already decided, measured, and limited. Leaving meant uncertainty. Storms, failure, loss. But it also meant growth. For many Vikings, the decision wasn't about courage or recklessness. It wasn't heroism or madness. It was inevitable, the natural outcome of forces too strong to resist, moving people the way unseen currents move the sea. By leaving Scandinavia, Vikings reshaped a continent. Their ships stitched together worlds that had never been directly connected before. Trade networks stretched from the markets of Baghdad to the cold shores of the Atlantic, carrying silver, silk, weapons, and ideas across thousands of miles. They introduced advanced shipbuilding and navigation techniques wherever they went. Hull designs, sail handling, and river navigation reshaped how Europeans moved goods, people, and armies. Waterways became arteries of power. Vikings founded towns that still exist today, not just as raid camps, but as permanent settlements, trade centers, and political hubs. Some leaders rose high enough to wear crowns. Others disappeared quietly, absorbed into local populations, their names forgotten but their bloodlines continuing. Yet everywhere they went, Europe changed. Borders shifted. Economies expanded. Cultures blended. And the Vikings changed as well. Movement transformed them more than violence ever could. Travel forced adaptation. Trade demanded negotiation. Settlement required compromise. Their identity was forged not only in battle, but in motion. By crossing rivers, seas, and cultural boundaries again and again. The Viking story is not just one of conquest. It is the story of how movement itself reshaped a people. And, in doing so, reshaped a continent. So why didn't Vikings stay home? Because staying meant shrinking lives inside a shrinking world. A future measured not by potential, but by limits already set. They didn't leave because they hated Scandinavia. They left because they refused to be trapped by it. Refused to accept a life where survival was the ceiling and ambition had nowhere to grow. The true Viking legacy isn't raiding or destruction. It's adaptation. The willingness to abandon comfort for possibility. To trade certainty for growth. To step into risk when safety no longer promised a future. That instinct didn't vanish with the longships. Every time humans migrate, explore, build, or challenge limits, They repeat the same decision Vikings once faced at the edge of the sea. The same moment of pause. The same question whispered by the horizon. Sometimes, staying feels safe, but quietly guarantees decline. And sometimes, leaving is the only way to survive.